During the Trump administration, a special counsel was appointed by the breathtakingly corrupt Bill Barr named John Durham to investigate the origins of Robert Mueller's investigation into whether or not Russia interfered in some way with the 2016 election. Recently, Durham filed a pretrial motion relating to charges against a guy called Michael Sussman, who had been a lawyer for the Clinton campaign. The charges are incredibly weak. It has something to do with Sussman lying to the FBI. But in order to, throw some red meat, Durham threw in some language, vague, legalistic jargon that the right has been running with over the last few days. And on Fox, of course, they're basically saying that what Durham has accused the Clinton campaign of doing is paying a tech company to infiltrate White House servers. Actually, that lie was first pushed by a guy named Kash Patel, who's a Donald sycophant who was installed briefly in the Department of Defense. So this lie is so egregious and ridiculous that even John Ratliff, another Donald sycophant who was briefly the director of national intelligence, had to go on Fox and say that it wasn't true. I'm going to read Donald's response to all of this, though, because between him and Fox, that's what the people on the right are listening to. They're not listening to a retraction or a disavowal by one guy. They're listening to Tucker Carlson, and they're listening to Donald Trump. Donald said this in a, official statement on his special stationery. This is a scandal far greater in scope and magnitude than Watergate, and those who were involved in and knew about this spying operation should be subject to criminal prosecution. In a stronger period of time in our country, this crime would have been punishable by death. In addition, reparations should be paid to those in our country who have been damaged by this. Well, as far as I can tell, the only person damaged by this would have been him, but this he's referring to didn't even happen. What's more important, though, and I want to be really clear about this, is that Donald is saying that members of Hillary Clinton's campaign, who he has falsely accused of spying, should be put to death. Now, even if they actually had committed any spying, which again, they did not, that still would not have been a reasonable punishment. This kind of violent rhetoric is becoming more and more the norm on the right. In response to Donald's statement, Jim Jordan, that execrable enabler of child molestation, said that Donald's statement was right on target. These kinds of over-the-top calls for violence against political opponents, we traditionally associate those with banana republics. Right now, though, it's become part and parcel of republicanism. It's not just a trend that more and more people are engaging in. The calls for violence, the violent rhetoric itself, are becoming more and more extreme and more dangerous. We have Congressman Thomas Massie from Texas, who recently said something like, if 30 or 40% of Americans believe that the government is behaving tyrannically, then they have every right to take up arms against the federal government. He went further and said that we, meaning those 30 or 40% of people who think that the government needs to be overthrown, should have enough guns to take on the United States Marines. The host who had him on his podcast threw in his 2 cents and said that he also believed that every American should be entitled to their own nuclear weapons because that's precisely what the founders meant when they wrote the Second Amendment. He didn't say that last part, but this obviously seems to be what these people think. So we have a sitting congressman advocating for the violent overthrow of the United States government. We have the disgraced former occupant of the Oval Office saying that it's not just reasonable, but necessary that people be put to death because they did something he didn't like, which, by the way, they didn't even do. And now we have the Republican National Committee codifying in an official formal resolution that the violence on January 6th was legitimate political discourse. Remember when during the first debate with Biden, Donald was asked to disavow the Proud Boys? And what he said instead was, stand back and stand by. Well, they were listening. And that message he sent them that night led them to the Capitol on January 6th. And now those actions, that violence, that incitement, the injuring of 140 Capitol and DC police officers, the deaths are all being characterized as legitimate political discourse. These aren't isolated incidents. They're not. I mean, we see this happening time and time again. And one of the problems is it's happening without any pushback. I don't see any of these people getting censured. We have anti-Islamic rhetoric that is directly putting Muslim members of Congress in danger. So we need to understand that all of these tactics are part of a larger authoritarian strategy. It's to incite their side, and it's to demoralize and destabilize, actually, the rest of us. And then there's another facet to this that I think we really need to be paying attention to. Their paranoia, or their pretense at being paranoid, is ramping up as well. We have Representative Troy Nehls, I think his name is, who's accused Nancy Pelosi and the Capitol Police of spying on him. We have Green, I won't say her real name because she's so repulsive. She actually accused a cabal of cold Spanish soup directed by Nancy Pelosi of spying on members of Congress, of spying on their legislative work, of spying on her staff, and spying on American citizens, all of which, of course, especially the part about gazpacho, is completely absurd. We now have Senator Marco Rubio, probably the most spineless creature this side of amoebas, claiming that the purpose of the January 6th committee is simply to embarrass and harass and smear Republicans. To which I say, if you're a sitting member of Congress who participated in any way in the January 6th insurrection, whether by refusing to cast your vote to have the election certified, or by inciting the crowd, by giving them a white power salute, right, Josh Hawley? Or by lying time and time again over the last year that the January 6th insurrection was even a big deal, then you know what, Senator Rubio, you deserve to be exposed, humiliated, smeared, and hopefully held accountable for that. Of course, Rubio then went on to accuse Biden of sending crystal meth and crack pipes to the Black communities in the country. I think he said that it was for racial equity. To say it's wrong is an understatement. This is obscene, and it's racist, These aren't dog whistles anymore. It's another tactic in this overall strategy of demoralizing, destabilizing us, and attacking the other in a way that is dangerous and that is only going to get worse. We now have 14 states with laws forbidding schools, K through 12 schools, to teach critical race theory, which, by the way, they never did. Donald has said that he wishes Joe Rogan hadn't apologized for using the N-word. Ron DeSantis, mass murderer and governor of Florida, agreed, and also suggested that Joe Rogan not only shouldn't apologize, but should be very proud, I suppose, of his use of the N-word. So all of this is of a piece. The right is using violent rhetoric to change the subject. They're using threats of violence to intimidate their opponents. And they're using virulent racism to divide us against ourselves. Because remember, these aren't dog whistles. They're being openly, blatantly, unabashedly racist. And it's for a reason. They're using these tactics because it's all they've got. But they're running with it. And they know it works because it worked for 5 years. If we're not careful, it's going to influence the outcome of the 2022 election in a way we're not going to like. So I would suggest that it's time that the Democratic Party stop bringing a butter knife to a gunfight. Because if the right is bringing bazookas and AK-47s, we need to bring a bunch of fucking nukes. Because that's where they're heading. Today, I'm really excited to have as my guest a Daily Beast columnist, commentator, frequently on MSNBC, recovering attorney, which I'm curious about, and also the author of the recent book, Go Back From Where You Came From, and other helpful recommendations on becoming American, which is a phenomenal book, and we are going to spend a lot of time talking about it. So, Fareed Zakaria, thank you so much for joining me today.
I am very happy to be here. I'm glad CNN gave me this leave to talk to my favorite Trump. We love Trump at CNN. It's great for ratings. So I'm hoping, and I also have adopted an American accent now, just to make myself blend more in this moment where people like me are told to go back to where we come from. So I appreciate you having me, Mary.
You guys at CNN really do love some of those Trumps. But seriously, let's take the mask off. It's Wajahat Ali.
It's actually Sanjay Gupta. No, let's take the mask off again. I actually got
so confusing.
Mary said this because in the Riverside podcast chat that we're doing, instead of saying Wajahat Ali, I wrote down Fareed Zakaria 2.0 because I knew she'd enjoy it. But I've been mistaken recently for Sanjay Gupta, and someone said, I love your medical analysis on TV. Thank you so much. And I just nod my head. What I do is I never get offended. I just agree. So I say, yes, thank you. And then I got someone confused me for Mehdi Hassan. He's British, by the way. And I said, yes, thank you. I'm a very good debater. And then the last one was Hassan Minhaj. He goes, we loved your show on Netflix. I'm like, thank you. I work very hard. So I just accept whatever South Asian you want to throw at me, I will be that person. I will cosplay.
You know, it's not so much the fact that, say, Mehdi's British or whatever. It's like you look nothing like any of them. That's the thing that's kind of, it's so American.
Yeah. You look like Megyn Kelly to me. It's like all the same. All you
okay.
All you
Those
white
are
women.
fighting words. Fighting words. You couldn't have picked a different white woman.
It was Trigger. I found the whitest woman I could. Like literally, my brain said, "Who's the whitest woman I could find?" And I swear to God, Megyn Kelly just like with like a black Santa Claus in a headlock. She just showed up.
Yeah. So, I'm Mary Trump. You're Wajahat Ali. I think we've established our identities well enough.
It only took 3 minutes.
But I just want to clarify something. You were recently a guest on one of my favorite podcasts, Mercer Rothkopf's The Secret Life of Cookies. And I actually told her to introduce you as Fareed Zakaria.
No, she told me. She confessed later on. After the podcast, first of all, she's lovely. You guys should listen to her podcast. She's a lovely, sweet person and very smart. And then she bakes cookies and like tasty treats, and then she eats them. And then you're like, I want to eat that by the end of the podcast. But then at the end of the podcast, she goes, Mary told me that, I should introduce you as Fareed Zakaria and you wouldn't be offended and you'd laugh. And I was like, she was correct. She goes, phew, I took a risk.
Well, I read your book, which is hysterical. So I was pretty sure you could handle that kind of humor to the extent that it's funny.
But you could also tell. See, the thing is, you could also tell it was done in good spirit and in the commentary and vein of what the book, or why I mention it, right? Like oftentimes, you're right. The ugliness of it is you all look the same. Why should we bother differentiating you? We're gonna lump you all, and all of you are gonna be flattened. And all you blacks are the same, and all you Muslims are the same, and all you browns are the same. And then we're just going to essentialize you by your worst traits. And you'll be the perpetual villain or the sidekick or the stereotype or the punchline. And your job is just to take it. And you should be grateful that you should even be grateful that we're giving you a speaking part. That's the insidious aspect of it.
Or allowed to stay here. And one of my favorite ways to undermine individuals is to make them totally responsible for things that other people who happen to look, have the same skin color, share the same religion, you have to answer to that. You have to condemn Muslim extremism. Why? It's just another way of undermining the individual and disempowering people.
It's completely flattens them, reduces them to stereotypes, takes away their complex history, their unique narratives, right? And with Muslims specifically, what you said is what people don't realize is what's happened, especially after 9/11. And I mentioned this, I spent time in the book about the moderate Muslim, right? Where is this magical moderate Muslim? This unicorn that lives in Narnia and drinks like halal root beer with Elvis. Why can't there be more? How come you haven't condemned violent acts done by violent people you've never met? And so anytime you see something happening, this just happened last month. Remember when that one gentleman from England, this one British Muslim guy that no one knows, even his family disavowed him, comes from London, goes to New York, then ends up in Dallas. And because he was animated by anti-Semitism, which flattens all Jewish people, he goes, let me now hijack the synagogue. And maybe, just maybe, by hijacking the synagogue, the Jews, in quotation marks, will then release Afia Siddiqui, this prisoner that some people think is a political prisoner, but she was, a violent extremist or identified as a violent extremist. One of the prosecutions during the war on terror, she was, convicted. And he thought by taking over the synagogue that I will somehow free Afia Siddiqui because the powerful Jews will release her, right? And what was interesting was simply because I'm a Muslim, Mary, number one, and because 10 years ago, the right-wing trolls found an article that I did not write on Afia Siddiqui that I simply retweeted, that alone was evidence that I was a terrorist sympathizer. This happened just last month. And then I had to then condemn her and condemn him. And I was like, I don't know this dude. And how come you don't ask the number one terrorist threat in America is white supremacist terrorism that no one talks about for some reason. And just very quickly, let me give you an analogy. Suppose there's a mass shooting done by a white dude. Probably is going to happen in a week or two. I hope I'm wrong. But that seems to be the trend.
Or tomorrow.
Yeah. Chad, who's eating flaming Cheetos and watching Netflix, is not asked to condemn violent acts done by this violent white person, nor is he expected to be all of a sudden like Arnold Schwarzenegger and go kill and hunt down white supremacists. But as a Muslim for the past 20 years, we are often given this lovely role of being the moderate only if we preemptively condemn violent acts, and we have to condemn hard enough, fast enough, strong enough, and smart enough. And even when we condemn, Mary, it's never enough, because then I become the nearly extinct moderate unicorn, and then I get asked, but how about the rest of the Muslims? And that's how you get flattened.
And one of the observations you made that is should be obvious on its face, but clearly isn't because of the flattening that white people in America seem to require of other races and religions, is that there's no such thing as a Muslim community.
That's right.
There are Muslim communities. It's not a monolithic thing. So that's just another way to misunderstand or not have to deal with the complexity of the fact that Muslim people are from many different places. They have many different traditions. They have different political ideologies, on and on and on. And by the way, we're talking about Americans here. So it's just quite something how that, and I don't think that's just something that exists on the right. I think it's a knee-jerk thing that has been allowed to perpetuate because of this country's terribly complicated and tragic history with race.
Yeah, I mean, look at Bill Maher, right? Like just 2 weeks ago, we're talking about that, and he, again, gives ISIS and Al-Qaeda exactly the legitimacy they've been craving for by ceding the ground to them and saying that, no, look, this is Islam. These are Muslims. And now people often say on the left, oh, Waj, you're being too sensitive. You darkies and you Muslims, just get over it. Bill Maher hates all religions. And I said, no, ladies and gentlemen. Listen to his words specifically again and again and again. He talks about Muslims. They're the mafia. They bring that desert stuff to the West. Look, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, this is traditional, again and again and again. And you sit there and you watch Bill Maher's show as he goes on these rants for the last 15 years. And you sit there and you just replace Muslim with any other group, and you're like, would this be allowed? Would liberals just sit there quietly? And the only liberal guests who have ever spoken up when he goes on one of these rants are Batman Ben Affleck, where there was a huge squabble, if you guys remember that, right? And Bill Maher was shocked as to why Ben Affleck was standing up for Muslims and Arabs, which he uses interchangeably, by the way. Only 20% of Muslims in America are Arab. Most of them are Christian, by the way, Arabs here in this country. And then also, it was Glenn Greenwald before he became a complete freak. The only two people who challenged Bill Maher. And so when you have even Bill Maher, who I know increasingly the left has become disenchanted with him, but let's be honest, he has represented the, I guess, center-left or the Democratic establishment left for a long time. He is rewarded by HBO for saying this stuff about Muslims, right, that he would not say about anyone else, where literally he's saying that no, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Osama, that's Islam. But the Muslims like Wajahat Ali, the 4 million Muslim Americans, or the overwhelming majority that is the victim of terrorism and has fought back against this extremism, the victims of the war on terror, who reject this extremism, they're the outliers. And so if you're getting this from the left, and it's like, me and Mehdi Hassan's a friend of mine, we kind of said this publicly on his show, and we joke about it, that I think anti-Muslim bigotry is the last safe space for bigots of all stripes. Like, there won't be a penalty. And even if you see with Ilhan Omar, right, regardless of what you think about her politics, like the shit that she gets, you're like, who else gets this? And of course she gets it because she's a black woman. She's Muslim and wears a hijab, and she was originally a refugee. And so then you're seeing, what are the consequences of making fun of one group, but then another group, you get a slap on the wrist.
Yeah, and as far as Bill Maher is concerned, I haven't watched him in I don't know how long, because he's been anti-Islamic forever. And like you said, that doesn't get noticed. It's only now that he's kind of going after the left and being praised by Fox News that people are starting to have a problem with him. And it reminds me of what just happened with Joe Rogan. That all started because of his COVID disinformation and his problem with vaccines. Right. But this should have happened a long time ago, because he's such a fucking racist.
It's like consistently. They had to remove like more than 70 episodes. It wasn't just one. 70 episodes on their own they removed. And it wasn't just him using the N-word, right? It was him inviting eugenicists, like people who are literally saying, black people are genetically inferior, and white people, when they moved away from Africa, are like, what? This is Nazi stuff. And then, comparing black people to Planet of the Apes. And then, so the question then for me is, why are these people consistently rewarded? Who gets to fail up in America? Who gets a pass? and who truly gets canceled, right? And so I think that's what's so interesting is the people who complain the most about cancel culture are the ones canceling everyone else. Books during Black History Month are apparently more dangerous to conservative parents than their kids getting COVID too soon.
Or getting shot.
Or getting shot. Yeah, we're at anniversary of Parkland, 4-year anniversary of Parkland, and in America, I don't, Mary. I think you and I, growing up, we never had shooter drills, right? We had like fire drills, and I got 3 kids now. My kids are in virtual school because my daughter is immunosuppressed, but I've heard as a parent, like this just shocked me, right? Because my kids are 7, 5, and 2, so I've only heard about fire drills, but my fellow parents are so casual, like, oh yeah, my kid did a shooter drill. I'm like, what's a shooter drill? Oh yeah, they do shooter drills in anticipation of a mass shooting and what kids should do in case one of their classmates is a shooter, or there's a shooter that just And we kind of say this so casually in America, and the reason why I'm mentioning this is because this is not normal, right? So the threats that are actually real in this country, the ones we choose to ignore, the people who perpetrate it, the ones who are seen as lone wolf and moderate, and they have economic anxiety. They're ordinary citizens engaged in a legitimate discourse on January 6th, versus the Black and brown communities who just get pummeled by the system. War on drugs, war on crime, war on terror. And, we always joke, because you have to have some dark humor. I just did this on Twitter. Could you imagine a bunch of Black and brown truckers who decided to completely disrupt the Western economy and the supply chain for several weeks because we didn't want to get vaccines? What would happen to us?
Yeah, or imagine if on January 6th it had been Antifa, which is a fictional thing, and everybody at January 6th was Black or brown.
BLM protesters.
We could do this forever, right? And everybody would be dead.
Chalk lines. We'd be chalk lines.
Yep, you would be chalk lines.
I would want to have a very theatrical chalk line, like a very melodramatic one with my hands like to the sprawled out.
You should work on that. Sort of instead of a shooter drill, you could do a chalk outline drill.
This is the dark humor that you need in life. Is like my friends and I, we practice our choreographed chalk line. So when we get like that heroic Michael Bay death, slow motion, like no. So when they do the chalk line, they're like, wow, that's a very impressive chalk line death.
Yeah, I think we can start a new tradition.
All the marginalized communities. Have you practiced your chalk line death? Oh, no. And they show me. And like, that's too rusty. You need more fingers, more pizzazz.
Jazz hands. Seriously, I want to get back to something you said earlier, because I think it is at the heart of a lot of what we're dealing with right now in terms of terrorism on American soil. The vast majority of people committing terrorist acts in this country are white men, largely Christian, if not almost exclusively Christian. Now, I don't remember how many years ago it was, but the FBI put out a report saying that. Specifically, that was the threat, not external Islamic terrorism, but white male Christian domestic terrorism. And the Republicans did not allow that report to be
It's about more than
released.
10 years ago, right?
It was more than 10. It was a long time ago.
It was a DHS report written by Daryl Johnson, who then wrote a book about his failed attempt to warn America. I think the book is called Homeland. I'll find out. I have it back here. I'll find out. But Daryl Johnson of the DHS at that time under the Obama administration talked about the rising threat of right-wing extremism, and that report was shelved because conservatives in the Republican Party realized they hit too close to home and would have hurt them politically. Obama was trying to get some bipartisan support for Obamacare at that time, so Democrats, being Democrats, bringing a pencil to a friggin' gunfight, said nothing. And Daryl Johnson was so disgusted that he went to Wired, and Spencer Ackerman then kind of did the expose. And then Daryl Johnson, I'll get the right name of the book, wrote this really good book about it, how this is the number one threat. But even in 2009, there you go, Mary, it was deliberately covered under the rugs by the conservative movement. And then we found out from the whistleblower just a couple of months ago, who it was in the Trump administration in DHS, that Donald Trump's administration deliberately downplayed the threat of white supremacist terrorism and instead increased the fake threat of Antifa and BLM. Voila.
Right. Yeah. So it's worse because now they're not even going after potential terrorist acts. They're making shit up. And I know it shouldn't be surprising, but it still is shocking that we have a political party over, 13 years ago, actually admitting that we can't release this report about white supremacist domestic terrorists because that's our base. It's going to hurt us politically. And that's even more the case now, right?
They're ordinary citizens. I mean, I think I tweeted this again today, right before doing your show, and it just shows you the kind of like just utter lack of memory that we have in America, where like the attention span of gnats, and I do not want to disrespect gnats, that we it's like if it bleeds, it leads, and there's chaos, and let's move on, let's forget, and in this ridiculous both sides false equivalence that we do, where we cede the ground to a increasingly extremist minority, and literally we always have to bend the knee for them, especially media institutions, corporate institutions, political institutions. Like, we're all hijacked by them, right? Case in point, it was just last week, Mary, where the Republican National Committee, not Marjorie Taylor Greene, not Paul Gosar, not some right-wing freak, the Republican National Committee on its own proactively decided to issue a statement that said the January 6th violent coup that was done by violent insurrectionists that left 5 people dead, including 1 cop, ordinary citizens engaging in legitimate political discourse. And people forget, they officially censured Liz mother effing Cheney. Her last name is Cheney. She was the number 3 ranking Republican with the last name Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. What was the crime, oh Mary Trump, of these 2 conservatives? Liz Cheney, who voted for Trump 93% of the time, and Kinzinger, who went 95% of the time. Their crime was that they said, a violent mob overtaking the U.S. Capitol for the first time in nearly 200 years, trying to overturn a legitimate election, and then trying to chase me and my colleagues down and trying to kill us, that's a step too far. And they censured them. And so I sit there, like, sometimes I think you and I need to talk, and people, your listeners need this, is that we're not being gaslit, we're not crazy, we have every right to be frustrated, and we're not dealing with a normal political party. We're dealing with, in my opinion, and you might disagree with me, I've said this for the past year, a radicalized, weaponized pro-death cult. It's a counter-majoritarian force that is actively attacking democracy, and they want minority rule at all costs.
Yeah, they're fascists because they're justifying and legitimizing using violence as a tactic to maintain minority power.
Right.
They use propaganda. They have a propaganda wing in Fox and OAN and Newsmax.
All of it. Podcasts, online magazines, all of it. The entire ecosystem.
I have a newsletter called The Good in Us, which is getting harder and harder to hang on to. But
the some good in some of us?
The good in some of us. Yeah, I should. You know what? I should rename it The Good in Some of Us. And I every week I kind of sum up what's going on, the bestseller list and the top podcasts, top Substacks, and I call it #Get the Fascists Off the List because they dominate every single space except the New York Times bestseller list. I know, again, it shouldn't be shocking. It isn't shocking, but because a lot of times, especially in Facebook, the algorithm favors these people.
Yeah.
But it just clarifies for me, and you referred to this earlier, how ill-equipped the Democratic Party seems to be for this fight we're in.
Yeah.
Because they continue to treat it like everything's fine, that this is a normal administration that followed another normal administration. And that's what drove me crazy about the Virginia gubernatorial race between Glenn Youngkin and I
McAuliffe.
almost said Terry Jones, but I don't think the guy from Monty Python.
No, he passed away. Rest in peace, Terry Jones.
He did.
We will not sully your memory.
No, but it would have been a much more interesting race.
Much funnier.
And he would have been a much better governor than Glenn Youngkin has proven to be.
Would have run a better campaign.
Well, yeah. But, whenever anybody says that, and McAuliffe, was uninspired, whatever, but, people said this about Hillary Clinton all the time. It's a bad campaign compared to whom? But let's leave that aside for a second. The thing that maddened me is that Glenn Youngkin got through that campaign without anybody once referring to him as a racist. Yeah. How is that possible?
So I'm here in Virginia, and I called that Youngkin's going to win, and Democrats here said, no, he's not. And then McAuliffe, it's his for the taking. And I said, you are not paying attention to the fact that they are trying to rebrand Trump 2.0 through Youngkin. It's going to work. They're going through schools. They're doing the dog whistle. People are terrified. Suburban parents are terrified when it comes to race, conversation about race, and also LGBTQ. Let's not forget, it started with the transgender bathroom stuff. And by the way, the county where it began, all this began, is one of the wealthiest counties in America, and which was one of the last to desegregate in America, right? So oftentimes when you look about the common man in Main Street, it's always like these rich, very well-organized hubs of conservative parents, right? Who are very terrified of certain elements coming in. And that's why schools have always been a fantastic launching pad for these type of culture wars, right? Because it always goes back to the dog whistle of, we can't let the urban element come in. Black people, brown people, and now LGBTQ. And so the reason why Youngkin was allowed to waltz in is because the Democratic Party, the Democratic movement are like, oh, we got this. We don't have to counter. This message is not going to work. And I wrote an article. I said, this is exactly the same type of message that they had with the anti-Sharia threat in 2010, right before the midterm elections. A manufactured crisis, a problem in search of a solution, and this time they're going after our kids and using race. It's going to be even more successful. You need to develop a counter message. No counter message, Mary, right? The only message was Trump. He's like Trump. But then, hey, Youngkin comes in with a smile and a vest, and what saved him in Virginia, ladies and gentlemen, is that it was very close. Oh, God, Trump got baited. Trump was about to come and campaign with Youngkin. I'm telling you, if Trump would have come here, flipped, it would have been McAuliffe by 2. Youngkin would have lost. Trump doesn't come, Youngkin gets saved, and instead it's like, oh, here's this smiling, young, wealthy, upstart who has decided to shake it up and go for school choice. And meanwhile, you're like, huh. So his school choice and his last ad, which drove it home, is banning books like Toni Morrison's Beloved. And look what happened. We kept saying it. You're not taking the CRT threat seriously. Boom. He wins. Republicans realize they got a winning message. CRT threat becomes book bans, becomes Stop the Woke Act, becomes Don't Say Gay in Florida. Now you're going after Holocaust studies. Now you're going after... You could pretty much cancel Black History Month under the auspices of the anti-CRT ban. I'm not saying this to be darkly humorous. Literally, all of Black History Month could be canceled. You're going after feminist studies, Handmaid's Tale. And if you step back and look at it, what are you seeing? The stories and narratives of the rest of us have to be erased, suppressed, and censored in order for the white Christian narrative to remain on top. And you're seeing that microcosm play out with the CRT ban, and you're seeing that play out literally across the political spectrum and cultural spectrum of America. There can only be one protagonist, white Christian male. Everything else dominates us. Equality is oppression. You're coming after us. You're trying to replace our narrative. We're not going to expand America and the American narratives. Instead, we're going to censor and lift up the American myth, where anyone can make it if you just bootstrap. And by the way, the person who fertilized this country's soil just happens to be your friendly neighborhood white man named Chet and Glenn. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. You asked me a simple question. I went on a rant.
I think we're done here. No, I'm kidding. But there's nothing I can disagree with there. The only thing I would add is... shout out to the media for also failing miserably in covering Virginia as well. Because I think that the media now does not think that it's their job to educate people.
That's true.
We see this time and time again. Most recently with Build Back Better, the media complaining that it's too complicated. People don't even know what's in this bill. Well, isn't it your job to tell them? Maybe break it down.
Well, that's the failure of media institutions, right? Like I mentioned in the book also. There's in the second to last chapter, I call out some of my colleagues, and I said that if Trump, let me put it this way, if Trump ran on a white person ban, okay, instead of a Muslim ban, if Trump ran on like policies that directly affected many of our colleagues in media institutions who are the gatekeepers, if it affected them, their grandmother, their grandfather, their wives, their children, Trump would not be elected, ladies and gentlemen. It wouldn't be a different game. It would have been different, like just not even like completely different sport whatsoever, right? Because they would not have given him the leeway. They would not have given him the press. They would not have invited him on SNL. Jimmy Fallon would not have said, "Oh, silly Donald, let me just touch your hair." Jeff Zucker probably wouldn't have given him that same advice. Les Moonves would not have said openly, Trump is bad for America, but he's great for business. Literally, that's what Les Moonves said. And Jeff Zucker said that also. He does not regret it at all. Jeff Zucker helped make Donald Trump, but because of the ratings, Mary. And so, all these people are releasing books right now, withholding information that you would think might help national security. I'm talking about, of course, Maggie Aberman and also Bob Woodward. To them, it was a game. To them, it's great ratings. I could get on TV. He just has, it's just economic anxiety. He's having a racial trip up. He's having a racial flare up. The system can hold him. And don't you worry. But can you imagine, Mary, if it actually affected them? What would they have done? What would the coverage have been like? And I believe the coverage I don't think he would have gone the coverage to even become president. And now that he became president, like I mentioned in the book, some of my colleagues were like, well, at least we get on TV more. And I'm like, well, democracy is getting destroyed, but we got on TV more. At least we got book sales. And then so now you're at this point now where you're mentioning the failure of media is, I believe, and I've said this, and I think you've said this, and other people have said this, that the job of media institutions in America is to be biased in favor of democracy. Right. You have to be biased in favor of democracy against fascism. That is okay. That is allowed. And if you cede the ground and allow, I remember when I was on CNN for a year, we used to have, look, I don't mind debating anyone on climate change and gun control and national security. That's fine. But I had to spend 6 minutes of airtime, which is precious airtime, as you know. 4 minutes of it got hijacked and derailed by a Trumper that not only I had to debate him, but then the moderator, the anchor had to come in. And I'm sitting there like, we just lost 6 minutes of precious airtime on a news show where I'm supposed to inform the public, but instead we're ceding ground to disinformation.
But that's a huge part of the problem. It's not Maggie Haberman, as awful as she is. It's not
Maggie Haberman.
It's not Joe Rogan. Actually, Elie Mystal said this about Joe Rogan. He's not the problem. It's the millions of people who listen to him.
That's right.
And it's not like he transformed them into racist, misogynistic homophobes. They went in search of him. Same thing with people who voted for Donald, for large part. With Haberman, it's not that she's unethical, which is, oh well, too bad. She's an access journalist in that way. She wrote in excess of 250 articles about Hillary Clinton's emails and hasn't said a peep about stuff that was going on in Donald's administration that was infinitely worse because she wanted to write a book. Why? She works for the New York Times. Do they not have any ethical standards? I mean, do they think that her writing an article about the fact that Donald, I can't even believe I have to say this, chewed up and swallowed classified information, ripped stuff into shreds that his aides that had to tape back together, and also clogged toilets in the White House?
Totally normal behavior. He had economic anxiety. That's what happens when you have economic anxiety. You eat paper.
Exactly. I mean, it is actually a psychiatric disorder.
Yeah.
Eating non-food
it's only
substances.
Classified paper that incriminates you of your criminal activity, by the way. Only those.
But it wasn't intentional. That's my favorite part.
No.
You can't prove intent.
It was a flare-up. It was a flare-up.
But does the New York Times think that story, those stories, wouldn't have sold papers?
This is the thing. You've touched upon it. The color that ultimately matters the most in America is the color green. If you look at Rogan, the head of Spotify, the Swedish billionaire by the name of Daniel Ek,
He's very white.
Yeah, pretty much just said, Yeah, it's worth it. $100 million, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, okay. When it comes to Facebook, Zuckerberg knows that he will lose millions of Facebook users if he enforces his own terms and agreements against the right-wing media ecosystem that uses Facebook to promote disinformation, hate crimes, fascism, right? Les Moonves, I think this quote is so pure. When he was the head of CBS, openly said, you could Google this, go to the Hollywood Reporter article where he says, Donald Trump might be bad for America, but he's great for CBS. Zucker admitted it when Ben Smith interviewed him. Like, now after the fact, in 2020, do you regret helping create Donald Trump? Nope. Great for ratings, right? And so at the end of the day, New York Times realizes it's two things. Number one, great ratings, great access, great eyeballs, great numbers, great hits. Number two, the institutional failure of America, corporate, media, financial, where we treat a radicalized, weaponized minority as somehow being a good faith other, the yin to the yang, the both sides. And I'll just show you how it's nonsense really quickly. 50-50 Senate, it's a split country, it's both sides. The 50 Republicans, ladies and gentlemen, represent 40 million less Americans. Donald Trump, who lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton, decided to put 3 white right-wingers on the Supreme Court. So now the Supreme Court, which is supposed to represent all of us, is hijacked by a right-wing extremist minority. Just go down the list. And so what the media does, instead of, and this is where the media fails, instead of calling them out as a right-wing minority extremist minority, they do the both sides, and they frame it as a both sides, which then, as we have seen study after study after study, actually harms democracy, harms the truth, and actually promotes disinformation. Because if you do a both sides analysis, very quickly, they did a both sides analysis of climate change, and now we have 99% of scientists who believe in climate change. Let's see the ground and give equal space to this one crank. What happened as a result? Climate change disinformation. Same thing happens with vaccine disinformation. Same thing happens with insert any of your Republican disinformation. And now, quick case in point, this Durham nonsense that's happening right now as you and I are speaking. I'm sitting there thinking to myself, right wing one, this non-story is now a major story. Everyone's talking about it. They're not leading with, this is bullshit. This is why it's bullshit. Instead, they're like, the right wing is alleging, and then all of a sudden, if you're an average Jose reading that, what are you thinking? Oh, look, Hillary Clinton. She did something shady. We did their work for them again.
Yeah, we seem to be quite good at that. And what's, at least the media, not that this is comforting, but at least they have an agenda that makes sense, as cynical as it is. It's all about the bottom line for them. What is it with the Democratic Party, though? You just listed probably a tiny, tiny percentage of the egregious acts the Republican Party has committed against this country that they've gotten away with, that the media have allowed them to get away with and helped them promote. And yet, we have a commission set up to investigate the issue of ways in which we can maybe kind of perhaps someday reform the Supreme Court.
Maybe, inshallah, God willing.
Right, exactly. Really? You can't just concede that this court is so illegitimate. I mean, it is up there with the court that made the Dred Scott decision, for God's sake.
Yeah, Plessy. It's a Plessy and Dred court.
It's a Plessy versus Ferguson court. Absolutely. It's like every bad court we've had throughout this country's
just look
history.
at Clarence Thomas. His wife, Ginny Thomas, is a right-wing hack who helped, and I quote, advised Trump on helping him purge his administration of those who were disloyal, and also assisted initially in the Stop the Steal rally, which became the January 6th violent insurrection, and then belatedly apologized. She is the wife of Clarence Thomas, who has not recused himself.
She financed 80 buses to take them to the insurrection. Yes, and Clarence Thomas doesn't have to.
And he won't.
They could have dozens of cases come before him that involve the insurrection, and to which his wife is directly and indirectly connected, and he doesn't have. There is no ethics committee telling Supreme justices what they have to do, which is why Amy Coney Barrett didn't recuse herself when an organization that put 7 figures into getting her appointed to the Supreme Court. I don't remember the case, but they were the defendants, and she didn't recuse herself.
Yeah.
So
it's a right wing. So two things really quickly. It's a good example, and I just want people to focus on this for 1 second before we talk about the failure of the Democrats. Is the right wing movement in America is a very incestuous, tight, connected group. Funders, the grassroots churches, the Federalist Society, media moguls, and so forth. It's so tight that you see this dark money being pumped into the Federalist Society, which then creates its list of right-wing hacks. Barrett was on it. Kavanaugh was on it, right? You see in the confirmation hearing of Kavanaugh, Laura Ingraham, a Fox News host, just magically appears in the room, right? You see the revolving door between Fox News and the White House. You see Clarence Thomas, his wife, literally is a right-wing extremist activist, as you said, funded the buses. So you have this very tight, incestuous, zealous, committed, ideologically, for the most part, I would say aligned group, going against a flabby, moderate majority that is represented by Democrats. It's very hard to organize this multicultural coalition, and it's even harder when the party that is supposed to organize it refuses to, if you will, empower the base, which is people of color, refuses to put their priorities first, refuses to actually listen and acknowledge their problems, keeps punting them to the second because they keep chasing Chet and Travis and Amy and Katie, who are drinking real coffee in the Rust Belt, wearing real hats, even though they haven't gone for Democrats since the 1950s. So that's number one. That's a big problem. Number two, the way the Democrats are built is they bring a pencil to a knife fight and Republicans bring a bazooka. They're just nerds. They're like, well, if we play by the rules, then maybe, and then and they don't flex their muscle. That's another thing I'll say is you have power right now. Like, look, yes, it's 50-50. You have the House, barely. You have the Senate, but you have it. And you have Joe Biden. Could you imagine, this is the difference between Democrats and Republicans, and we could talk about this. If Republicans were in control right now and Democrats did all this shady shit, like
there would
January
be no
6th.
Filibuster.
No filibuster. People would be in jail. Nonstop smear campaigns.
There would be 17 seats on the Supreme Court.
17 seats on the Supreme Court. There'd be the subpoenas. There'd be enforcement of the subpoenas. Literally, they would beat them down. But Democrats did nothing. Biden
and Harris would have been impeached. Hillary Clinton would probably be in jail. I'd probably be in jail. Seriously, this isn't funny because it does show you how incapable the Democrats are of understanding the threat we face. As you said, they need to play by the rules. There are no rules. The rule book was burned to a crisp by the Republican Party. So we need to meet them where they are, which is to be, as you said earlier, an anti-democratic, counter-majoritarian party that is looking to regain power illegitimately and stay in power, even though they're the minority in this country. I think like Mitch McConnell is looking to set up a theocratic apartheid state. And they don't seem to understand how little time we have here. So, I guess I'm not as interested in why aren't they doing it? Because who knows? I mean, some of what you said, who knows what goes on behind the scenes? Is it just because some of them are institutionalists? Some of them, is it collegiality? Like, I almost lost my mind when Joe Biden last week
praised Mitch McConnell,
referred to Mitch McConnell as a man of his word, a man of honor, and his friend.
Yeah.
Like, okay, this is a man who's out to destroy you, your administration, and the American people, but sure. With friends like that, as they say. I'm more interested in what can we do, or what should Democrats do in the very little time we have remaining of American democracy, potentially, before the midterms.
So it's what happens is that Democrats believe, and you just hear them in their own words, that if you just give in to these, lowercase t terrorists, they'll behave better. If you give them a column, they'll be better. If you invite them to be a guest, they'll be better. They'll stop complaining. It's like working the refs. The Republicans work the refs. It's all about projection. And if we just cave into them, it will inspire better behavior. But as you accurately said, we're dealing with fascists. It empowers the bullies. And sometimes you have to punch a bully in the face. And what we've seen is they have weak chins, but we don't punch back, right? We go around them. We give them compliments. And another analogy I always give is the Peanut cartoon. We are Charlie Brown and they're Lucy.
That's right.
And you're like, Mitch McConnell, do you promise this time that you're going to abide by the own absurd standard you created to rob us of Merrick Garland? He goes, sure, I will. Oh, the election has already started and RBG died and millions of people have cast their vote. Are you going to abide by the own standard you created? No, I'm not. Here's Amy Byrd. Democrats, now you have a majority. Are you just going to bum rush whatever judge you want because you have every right to and give a middle finger to bad faith Republicans? No, we have a list of black female Supreme Court justices and we think we're going to get bipartisan. I'm sitting there thinking who the F cares, man? Who the F cares? Just nominate whoever you want, get them on the court. And so we're dealing with that Democratic Party, which is a microcosm of every institution that bends the knee and thinks that if we cave in to them and their vaccine mandates and the truckers and the parents and the school boards, that they'll be better. And what you and I have seen and are saying is they will not get better. They will get further empowered. They are fascist. They want minority rule for white power. So what we have to do is first recognize it, which I think is very important because I don't think everyone's around to recognize it, Mary. Recognize what we're dealing with. Recognize the threat. Recognize their endgame, like a bad James Bond villain, or rather I should say like a very helpful James Bond villain. They're literally telling you the plot in the first 10 minutes of the movie. There's a 6-point memo they wrote for us. There's a slideshow. They're telling you. The Republicans running for Secretary of State are telling you we're going to reject the popular vote and put in our electors and literally do a coup. So take them literally and seriously. Now that you've taken them literally and seriously and you know the threat and you know the plan, you do the counter. The counter is we have to build a multicultural coalition of the willing. You have to unite. You need numbers, and we have the numbers. If you don't agree with each other on 10 of 10 things, fine. Stop with the purity tests. Liberals are really good at killing other liberals. They look for, what do they say? Liberals look for heretics and Republicans look for converts, right? If you can align with someone over democracy, and if Liz Cheney, who is odious in her politics but is willing to help you and the majority carry your water for democracy, build that multicultural coalition. Run, and then final thing I'll say is, and then we could talk about more if we have time, but local. They're specifically trying to seed the ground by terrorizing local school boards, local teachers, local healthcare officials. And what happens is people say, I can't deal with this shit, man. I can't have death threats. And they come in. We have the numbers. When we show up to the school board meetings with numbers, they shut up. When you do vaccine mandates in New York, they whine. And then what happened today? 99% got the vaccines, only 1%. That's right. We need these stories to remind us that we have the numbers and we have the power, but we're a flabby moderate majority dealing with a zealous minority. Yeah,
and I can't emphasize enough how much I wish the Democratic Party empowered its base the way the right empowers its white supremacist, racist, fascist, Nazi base, and also, and then I want to pivot to your book. If you want bipartisanship at this point, then you're making common cause with fascists.
Yeah.
And we need to stop doing that immediately. And yes, focus, Democrats out there listening, focus on local races, focus on attorneys general races, secretary of state races, school boards, et cetera, because that is actually where the scary stuff is happening. And I think finally we should all agree, as you said, to be one issue voters this time around. We're voting for democracy. Otherwise, we don't get anything.
We don't get anything. Can I say one final thing that Democrats fail at, and Republicans I give them compliments for? Republicans band down the hatches and circle the wagons for their most extreme freaks. Marjorie Taylor Greene, Paul Gosar, Lauren Boebert. Notice they do not condemn them. What do Democrats do? They use the bad faith weaponized language of Republicans against fellow Democrats.
That's right.
We're too woke. Stop being so woke. Let us kill our own party. And you're like, wow. That's what James Carville did in Virginia. We lost because we're too woke. I'm like, why are you using the bad faith weaponized language of the right wing against fellow Democrats? Why?
And it's absurd. It's just absurd. Progressives aren't the problem here.
No. And the reason why they attack progressives, and this is all, I have to say this, I'm sorry. This is all coded language. Woke, progressive is coded language for black people and brown people.
That's right.
Stop whining and complaining. Darky, be quiet. We have to win an election. We're going to punt immigration reform, police reform, income inequality, BBB second, and your job is just to take it. And so in order to court Chet and Travis and Katie and Amy in the Rust Belt, we will use this language, not realizing we are depressing and hurting our own base and our own party. That's my 2 cents.
Well, you're right. And having written fairly extensively about this, it is just something that doesn't get recognized enough on the left because Americans hate being called racist, right? They hate it more than anything. Instead of recognizing why they might be, and I'm not saying they are racists. Right. That's a different issue. That's a choice. I'm saying racist because it's in our friggin' bones at this point. It's in the
marrow,
DNA.
in the DNA.
And unless you face it and deal with it, it's never going away, right? So, but white Democrats don't like hearing it any more than actual people who choose to be racists. So they're completely blind to it. And that, to me, is one of the biggest problems. I know it's a long-term solution that would be required. That's not going to change overnight. But at least some acknowledgement of it would be really nice. And it just never happens. And it's so, I cannot imagine being a Black American, a Muslim American, a Native American, that was stupid, a Native American. As Toni Morrison once said, American means white. Everybody else is hyphenated. Yep. Sorry about that hyphenating. Any minority of color, I cannot imagine stepping up every single election cycle, waiting out 8 hours in line, having to travel because all of your polling places have been closed. And yet still, the Democratic Party takes it for granted that, of course, they're going to show up, even though we've fulfilled none of our promises.
They're not going to show up in this election. I'm telling you. If you talk to black folks and brown folks, they're like, we risked death and stood during a pandemic for 8 to 12 hours. Remember that? Supreme Court was allowed to vote from mail, but then this right-wing hackery majority decided, these polls in Wisconsin, they're going to have to show up. But they did. And you won Georgia because of black voters. And you won probably even Philadelphia and Pennsylvania and all these other states, because in Michigan even, with a lot of these quote-unquote urban centers showing up in big numbers, right? But what happens is we're always told, listen, it's a crisis. The nation is teetering at an edge. We'd love to talk about police reform and immigration reform and income inequality, but next time. And even, look, black voters gave Biden his life, like Clyburn. People forget it. Clyburn came out, and then the South then literally rejuvenated his career because he was losing. At that time, he was losing to everybody, right? He was losing to Warren. He was losing to... he was fifth or seventh or something. Fifth. He was way down. And so that's why you want to always remind Democrats, this is your base. It's a multicultural base. You haven't gotten the majority of white voters since the 50s. Majority of white women have not gone for Democratic president since the 50s. They only went once for LBJ and one term of Clinton. You have 85 to 90% black. You got 70% Asian, 70% Jewish, 70% Muslim. And you got maybe, if you're lucky, 40 to 45% white. That's it. That's your coalition. Get that coalition out. Get them in numbers. You win. That's right. And it's so stupid. It's the only word, or craven and insulting. We just need to let them be racist for a little longer. No, you know what? No, but that's what it is, Mary. Look, it goes back. There's a recurring theme here in this conversation. Don't upset them. Don't rattle them. You don't understand how they'll be when they get angry. And I always joke, and I'm like, you ever seen the movie The Avengers? And then Captain America at the end tells Mark Ruffalo before he turns to Hulk, all right, time to get angry, big guy. And he turns around, he goes, Cap, the trick is I'm always angry. And that's what I want to say, is that this right-wing base hates you. They hate you. They're always angry. No matter how much you placate, no matter how much you give them compliments, no matter how much you do bipartisan, no matter how much you bend the knee, they will try to destroy you politically, economically, when it comes to school boards, when it comes to the media. And all of our institutions still believe, Mary, if you're just nice to them and don't trigger their economic anxiety, then they'll be okay. And what it really means, if I may be blunt on your show, is we don't want to piss off white people and talk about racism because it gets them really upset. So listen, darky, be quiet. Just sit there, be nice, talk about diversity, and give them Ta-Nehisi, and give them Michelle Obama, give them some Beyonce, but don't mention white supremacy. Don't give them Toni Morrison, that's too black. Maybe give them LeBron. And, give them Crazy Rich Asians, and then baby steps. We're going to baby step our way towards racial harmony and equality.
Well, listen, it's only been like 400 years. What's the rush?
That's what it is.
And that's what people totally forget about the historical context here. This isn't like we've just been saying, be patient for a couple of election cycles. White people have been doing this since the 17th century in this specific context of enslaving people, black people in America, kidnapping black people to bring to America, and doing that for generation after generation after generation. So this isn't a new thing. We've been asking people of color just to stay in the back of the line forever.
For the betterment of the country. For the betterment of the country.
Yeah, sure, as long as you said, that the country means white people. Yeah. So and that's why when Biden said that to McConnell, people gave me pushback for being angry about that.
No, I was angry too.
Said, Look,
I was angry too.
He has to work with McConnell. Look, he could have said nothing, because that kind of statement, how that demoralizes our side.
Right.
It just reminds us how ill-equipped or clueless or white, our leaders are, that they just don't have the intestinal fortitude to face the facts and to do what's right. And it reminds me how, white people who do the bare minimum always get let off the hook. Remember when McCain was running against Obama and people gave him all of this credit for standing up when that woman accused Barack Obama of being, I don't remember what she was wearing. Okay, she was wearing red.
Yeah.
Of being a Muslim. John McCain didn't say, so what if he were? Why would that matter? He said, no, he's not Muslim. He's a good person. But he got praised like he had done something
for the rest
heroic.
Of us, right? The reason why we say that is because we remember that was etched in our heads. He goes, I heard that Obama is a Muslim and an Arab, and he goes, no, he's not Muslim or Arab. He's a good man, and I could see what he was intending. And because the bar was so low and is so low that many of us who are Muslim and Arab were like, well, thank you for at least pushing back in 2010. Wow. But at the same time, you're like, he should have said what Colin Powell later said on Meet the Press. So what if they're Muslim? So what if he's Arab, right? But the bar was so low. And I want to just share with you how radical and extreme the Republican Party has become. I joke about this, but this is a great tell. If George W. Bush, who I think you and me, Mary, we're old enough that we would agree, before Trump, we would probably say that was the most, just terrible president in U.S. history. My God, He was so terrible. Then Trump comes in and makes George W. Bush's legacy look much better. If he was to run for Republican president in 2024, he would be rejected by the party for being a Muslim lover. If John McCain was to run, he would be rejected.
Well, that would be weird.
Yeah, but the spirit of John McCain was resurrected, right?
Okay.
Yeah, if it was reanimated like the Tupac hologram. He would be rejected, right? And so, and these guys weren't like centrist. They were like right. Like George W. Bush had a hard right campaign, ladies and gentlemen, helped like usher in the war on terror. Katrina, just disaster, Patriot Act. But because at the very least they were not overtly racist, and at the very least they were pushing back against overt racism, that to the modern Republican Party and Stephen Miller is an act of a rhino. And they have no place in the Republican Party, to the point where Liz Mother effing Cheney, who used to be the number 3 ranking Republican, has now been censured by her party, and the Wyoming Republicans decided to kick her out of the Republican Party in Wyoming. And now the House Republicans are saying she can't win an election again. They're actually going to primary her. This is where we're at.
And by the way, Liz Cheney, whose political hero is Genghis Khan, also known as Dick Cheney.
That. What?
Yes. Yeah. So
that pacifist, that centrist pacifist known as Genghis Khan, who was all about democracy while he was pillaging and raping nations. Oh, good to know.
Yeah. No, it's Dick Cheney. I was just kidding.
Oh, okay.
Well,
that's hilarious. I thought, I actually believed it too. Dick Cheney.
Because it's believable.
Isn't that hilarious? I'm like, oh, like Liz Cheney one day came out, who my political hero is? Genghis Khan. I'm like, yeah, I believe that.
I mean,
he was successful. He was successful.
She would be forgiven for a lot of things if she said that. I hope you have some time to stick around, because I really do want to talk about your book.
Yes.
Again, it's called Go Back to Where You Came From and Other Helpful Recommendations on Becoming American. I cannot urge you enough to read this book. It blew me away, and I'm going to just embarrass you and tell people why. It's... as I said earlier, you have an extraordinarily uneventful life. So it must have been so difficult to turn it into an interesting narrative. No, seriously, your life story itself is fascinating. Your childhood, your family, the complications you guys all went through, being a Muslim in America, and before September 11th, after September 11th, but it's incredibly well written. And one of the things about it is that you find humor where it's almost like you find humor where one shouldn't be able to, and it helps because a lot of it is hard. It's hard to take in. And then despite the fact that it's really funny, it's very moving in parts as well. And, there are scenes that still just stick with me. And, we're just talking about John McCain and how people like Bush, and even though they weren't, you can't exactly say they were pro-Muslim.
No, we're not.
No, but they weren't good on the issue, and it was still even. I know that was post September 11th, but it reminded me that this is a long-standing problem, and that one of the scenes in your book that really just made me so sad. It was the day of September 11th. You and a group you belong to of other Muslim students were called into, I guess, the dean's office.
Chancellor's office.
The chancellor's office. And, when I started reading that scene, I thought, oh, okay, good. Like, they're going to ask if you guys are okay. And what it did is it reminded me, first of all, how ill-equipped a lot of adults are to deal with the trauma of children. But then it took a turn, and really what they wanted to do was make it clear to you that you were suspicious in their eyes, and that they didn't necessarily feel like they could trust you because a bunch of maniacs who had nothing to do with you flew 2 planes into the World Trade Center. I mean, I know it was... there's a lot else going on in the book, but that scene sort of crystallized something for me. So can you talk a little bit about how sort of the evolution of your experience as a Muslim American, in the sense of the reality that it was never good? Which,
Yeah,
I think white Americans just, just all started after September 11th. No, this is not true.
No, I appreciate that, and I thank you for your kind words, and thank you for reading it. I remember when I finished it, and I was supposed to send galleys out. I think I don't know why we had never talked before, but I'd been following you on Twitter. I'd read your book. I'm like, I think Mary Trump would like this, and I'm like, let me reach out to her, and you were very kind and actually responded back to me. I was like, oh, look at that. So thank you so much for your support of the book.
Don't tell people that it took me much longer than it should have to read it.
But you were very kind, and you kept apologizing, which I appreciated. It reminded me of me. Like, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for everything. I promise one day I'll get to it. I swear. I can't breathe. I haven't slept in 2 years.
And I did.
And I felt terrible.
At least I read it.
Yeah, and then I being the shameless son of immigrants, well, I'm like, well, the door is open, so let me just keep that door open and keep bothering her every 2 months. The book.
Well, I told you to.
Yeah, no, and you
I sent
gave me
you
permission.
DMs. Please bother me.
You gave me, which was very kind. What the book does, I hope, the book is about how do you love a country that doesn't love you back, and it is an elegy for the rest of us not named J.D. Vance. and the elegy for the rest of us who, like you said, have a hyphen or an asterisk, or are reminded recently by Mitch McConnell that there are Americans, but then there are African Americans, and how this country can turn on you on the drop of a dime overnight. And specifically, I tried to connect the dots about this country called America, specifically post 9/11, but I kind of connect the dots historically to how we got to Trump, but through a very culturally specific lens of my story as well, as being the son of Pakistani Muslim immigrants, born and raised in the Bay Area, California. And, what I talk about, and I hope people take this away, especially white readers, and so far they seem to be really absorbing it, and the feedback has been so lovely, is that when we talk about white supremacy, we're not talking about white people. Let me repeat this.
Right.
When we talk about white supremacy, which I kind of lovingly call the whiteness in chapter 2, is we're not talking about white people, which is a social construct. And even the Irish Catholics were not considered white. Eastern European Jews were not considered white. The Germans were not considered white, but they eventually were able to be absorbed into this Omicron being whiteness that comes and wants to devour everything. A system, it's a structure, it's a paradigm, it's an ideology that elevates one group and only one group to be the protagonist of the American narrative and says the rest of us, we can be here with conditions. And this book is all about, well, I don't want conditions. I don't want special standards. I want equal standards. And by the way, the only way to stretch and push this country to be the best version of itself or to even achieve the American dream is to have us as co-protagonists. That's the only way this experiment's going to work. Meanwhile, what we're witnessing right now, and we've talked about it, but I'll just mention it, is the death rattle of white supremacy that, in my opinion, has become the death march. We literally have talked about it for the past hour. And their idea of America is to restrict, restrict, restrict. And so the war on terror could not have happened without anti-black racism. It could not have happened without the restrictions on immigration, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I talk about, right? These forces that have always tried to restrict. Donald Trump would not have happened without the war on terror and the demonization of Muslims, where America was like, let's lump all these things called Muslims as an other, and they'll be represented by Osama bin Laden and the 19 foreign hijackers who brought down the two towers, and the first hate crime after 9/11 will be against an innocent sick man with a beard and a turban in Mesa, Arizona, who's a gas station owner because a white supremacist said, I need to get those guys who brought down the towers. Oh, look, a brown guy. Bigots aren't nuanced, people. Bigots aren't nuanced. And so what happened to me, very quickly, I was a senior at UC Berkeley, 20 years old, undeclared, trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life, had the model minority stereotype upbringing, two parents who came here after 1965. They worked hard, Mary, pulled themselves up from the bootstraps, kept quiet, and they were told that the Faustian bargain for this model minority is you will get the American dream, but you have to be invisible. Right? So I'm living this dream. I'm the son of these two parents who've worked hard, and overnight, two towers fall. Fork in the timeline. Pre 9/11, post 9/11. Overnight, Muslims become the boogeyman. Overnight, I become us and them. Overnight, citizen and suspect. And for the next 20 years, my loyalty and patriotism is always held as suspect by a nameless judge, jury, and executioner that has held me guilty for the violent crimes committed by other people I've never met. And I always, like Toni Morrison has said, have to prove my civilizational worth and capacity to this nameless judge, jury, and executioner. Prove you have literature. Prove you have culture. Prove you're moderate. And that's why racism is so exhausting. Because you spend your whole life defending yourself, and then you realize it's never enough. And so this book kind of charts how the rest of us, and me in particular, had the trauma of 9/11 and the war on terror, and how this impacted the country, and how honestly that type of accepted Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry literally leads to Trump, ladies and gentlemen. Let's not forget that he ran on a Muslim ban. That's what gave him a national platform. Ben Carson was the first one to do it, and people thought, oh my God, there's going to be a backlash. People forget. Ben Carson was the first one to say, I need Muslims to renounce Sharia before I have them in the White House, right? Going off again, the 2010 anti-Sharia hysteria. He got more crowds. He got huge fundraising. He got a bump. So Donald then, people forget, go look at the clip. At another televised speech, one person yells out, what about the Muslims? He goes, we need to do a complete ban until we figure out what the hell is going on. And then with Anderson Cooper, he said, I think Islam hates us. And then he did that nonsense about Muslims celebrating 9/11, right? That's what led him, in part, the racism, the xenophobia.
I wanted to ask you about that because it seems like one of the strategies or tactics on the right is to shove the absolute worst person down our throats.
That's right.
So after we have our first black president, we have to get the most racist white guy
obligatory
out there. And after his egregious lies, and there were many of them about September 11th, we have to get this anti-Muslim bigot who doesn't care. It's not like he was informed about anything or really thought it was good policy.
Bullshit artist.
So, yeah, that's being kind, but yes. And a very weak person. I still don't understand why the other Republican nominees just didn't punch him in the chin. But anyway,
we've talked about that. We've talked about it already.
And here we are.
Because why rile his base?
But I mean, during the primary, they just never learned. All you need to do is call him a loser and tell him to shut up. But anyway, so that aspect, I took the 2016 election very personally, but for very different reasons.
I wonder why marry Trump.
I don't know. I'm still working through it in therapy. But it must have felt extraordinarily personal to you too.
Yeah. I mean, look, you mentioned three things, right? I want to break them down. We talked about this. Donald Trump has an audience. People forget that. Yeah. Joe Rogan has an audience. The more racist and cruel Donald got, the more popular he became with Republicans.
And misogynists
and homophobes and anti-Muslim bigots. And the whitewashing of this narrative from media institutions, the inability to look at racism and call it out, which we've talked about. Let me give you another example. Oh, they're suffering from economic anxiety. A refusal to actually look at all the studies that have been done that conclude that it was the predominant motivator of right-wing voters for Donald Trump was cultural and racial anxiety. Specifically...
And lower-income voters went for Hillary Clinton.
Under 50,000 went for Hillary. No one talks about that, okay? And then you sit there and go, okay, millions of my fellow Americans decided this incompetent vulgarian who ran on a Muslim ban and a wall is the best president after Obama helped save this country from 8 years of disaster. I think that the election of Trump after Obama, and specifically, let's not forget, Trump first threw his hat in the ring with the racist, anti-Muslim conspiracy theory of the birther conspiracy. That people always forget. You got to connect the dots, which I tried to in the book, right?
Yep.
Beautiful microcosm of America. Every time there's 2 steps forward on racial progress and equality, one giant step back. White supremacy comes and chokeholds us back. Donald Trump is the chokehold, in my opinion. So who does America get after Obama? Of course they get Trump, who ran on the birther conspiracy, the Muslim ban, and the wall. And I took it super personally because I remember the weakness of Democrats. 2016, Democratic National Convention. I'm with Huffington Post covering the convention, right? We're running around trying to do stories. One of the segments that I do is the following, kind of the old school Daily Show segment, tag-in-cheek, which turned out really well, where I ask all these voters, Bernie voters, Hillary voters, even Trump voters, will you visit me in the camps if Trump wins? Kind of dark humor, right? All the white voters, I don't care if they were Bernie or Clinton or Republican voters. You know what they said? It'll never happen. Muslim ban will never happen. He won't win. He's just saying it to get voters. I'm like, I think the Muslim ban will happen. He goes, no. None of them took it seriously. The only people who actually took it seriously were black voters. Like, yeah, that might happen. And that shows you the lived experiences of being a person of color versus often, not all, white folks, because some white folks got it. That shows you how we take the threat seriously. That shows you how we view Donald Trump's presidency. It wasn't a game. It wasn't a joke. He wasn't funny. And that just goes to show, reveal an earlier point I made, Mary, that if Donald Trump attacked white people the way he attacked Mexicans, black people, refugees, and Muslims, he would never have been elected because we would not have ceded the ground to him, treated him as a comic foil, helped him, platform him on CNN, invited him to SNL. But because it was the rest of us, it was okay. And that's why I took it personally.
And that normalization has proved to be so dangerous, and it's still happening. The media aren't saying, should Donald even be allowed to run again? They're saying, will he, which implies that he can, because he's done nothing wrong, or whatever, or he's above the law, or he's so special that we should allow him to pull a Grover Cleveland. So
a nice deep cut there with Grover. Well done.
Thank you.
That was good.
I like to pull out my Grover Cleveland.
That is very impressive. I like it.
Reference.
The kids are like, what, the Grover Cleveland? What's that?
Is he a character on the Muppets?
Yeah. He sounds like a Garfield character.
Not that Grover. Right, it's a different Grover. So the problem I find is that so-called Trumpism seems to not to need him anymore, because that's just the Republican Party now. And I don't think he's fundamentally changed the Republican Party. He's revealed it to be what it is. But he's also given them this new permission to be as bad as they want to be in a way that isn't subtle.
Yep. Well, I think, and I actually was thinking about this yesterday. I'm really curious about your take because maybe I'm being too cynical. I said earlier, just to a friend of mine, that I think by 2024, maybe 2025, the Republican Party will not have to use any dog whistles with white nationalism. Like, I think they can openly run on white power. I thought we'd get there by 2024, 2025. Some people thought I was being too cynical. I've been right about a lot of stuff, if I might pat myself on the back. And I think that's the natural extension. And I saw a glimpse of it where Donald, I think was at his last rally, maybe just a few weeks ago. You remember that blatant racist lie where he said that white people are now forced to go to the back to get vaccines?
Especially in New York.
Yeah. And then Stephen Miller doubled down on it, this white victimhood. And then Washington Post did a good piece on this, I've been following the trends where NPR did this poll a couple of years ago where a majority of whites feel like they're the greatest victims, but it was a small majority. I think that number is going to balloon to 60 to 70%. And that's where I think we're going to see the emergence of the words literally white power. Am I being too cynical?
I don't think it's cynical at all. I think it's realistic. And that's important. I have a final question I'd like to ask.
Because I've talked too much.
Before that, no. There's so much to talk about. Actually, I wanted to talk more about your story, but there's so much going on right now. There's such urgency in what's happening right now that I wanted your take. I'll have to have you back to talk about the arc of your life and your journey because it's so fascinating. But today, I really did want your perspective on what's happening now because it's so interesting. You know your stuff, and you don't pull punches. And I'm very tired of people on the left pulling punches. So before I ask you my last question, I have one other thing that's related to what you were just talking about. I think that we need to be not negative, not cynical. I think cynicism, when I hear people saying, oh, well, 2022 is already lost. I'm like, well, okay, have that attitude and it will be. That's cynical. But facing facts, facing that potential that you mentioned, I don't even know that it's going to take that long because it's already happening. And because I don't think what happened with critical race theory in Virginia was really a dog whistle, because it was such a massive lie that was based in pure racism.
Yeah.
That I don't know. So I agree with you. So having said all of that, and I don't think we have until 2024 to turn this around. I think we have until November 2022. What are your thoughts about what happens in the next 9 or 10 months?
Yeah, I agree with you. I choose to invest in hope also because I think the alternative is cynicism and apathy, and that basically means that you are resigning yourself to being a spectator and checking out. I can't afford that. I have kids. I got 3 kids, and I'm an American. And trust me, as a student of U.S. history, I think fascism is worse than democracy, guys. You do not want to be under the rule of fascism. Yes, fascists fail, but when they fail, eventually, a lot of people die, and a lot of people get oppressed, and a lot of people disappear. And I don't use the F word lightly, but I have been using it. I wrote about it. And the warnings that myself and others have given, we were initially ridiculed and mocked, but I have the receipts. And it's not because I have this, prescient foresight or I'm brilliant. No, I just connect the dots and I pay attention. And all you have to do is connect the dots and pay attention, be a student of American history, and be aware of the forces that are at play right now and what they're playing for. And what they're playing for is power. Power by any means necessary. And the ideology that moves many of them, all the data shows this, is white supremacy, even though they don't admit it, or even though they don't even admit it to themselves. This country can only be a country for a certain segment that has to be at top. It has to be white Christian males. And they are either the heroes of this narrative or the victims. They are never the villains. No one's ever the villain of their narrative. If you listen to them, heroes or victims. They're victims because the rest of us, Mary, me, the Jews, black folks, others, are trying to weaken Western civilization and replace them. And they will not be replaced in their homeland, the land of their father and grandfather who birthed this nation from nothing. That's what we're dealing with.
We're very scary.
Yeah. We're terrifying. And so what we need and what we want is a multiracial democracy. We're not going to get along. We're not going to agree on everything. But what we say is, that's okay. You live your life, I live my life, and our children have the right to the American dream and the right to achieve it. And so that's what's at stake. And so what I think what's happening in the next 9 months is this fundamental fight for our democracy, because my fear is that we're going to lose the House. And historically, that's the trend. And you have gerrymandering, and now you have voter suppression. It seems like we're going to lose the House. It's not a given, but it seems like we're going to lose the House. What also is going to happen, maybe, just maybe we keep the Senate or we barely lose the Senate, right? And so I think what's going to happen then, what happened with Obama's second term, then the Democrats are going to say, I guess we can't do bipartisanship. I guess I'm going to have to flex my muscle and do this by myself. And so what I want Joe Biden to do, and what I want Democrats to do, is you have 9 months. You can do a lot in 9 months. You can flex your muscle. You can flex your power. And I think what you have to do is expose the villainy and extremism of the right wing almost on a daily basis. Television works. Do these hearings televised.
Absolutely.
Literally, you need the Justice Department to wake up. Merrick Garland has to figuratively crack skulls, figuratively, not literally, for the love of God, police officers. But I mean, you go after these people. Because in the absence of having any accountability, is going to depress the Democratic vote. Why the F do we put you in power? And also is going to give license to robbers to rob in broad daylight. And they're going to rob us of our democracy. And then I want Joe Biden to hit hard. And I want this also to happen. Last thing I'll say. You have a vice president. Her name is Kamala Harris. She's the first black woman to be elected. Maybe, just maybe, you want to circle the wagons, batten down the hatches, applaud her, appraise her, use her, unleash her. Instead, what the Democrats have done, they have already conceded 2024 and thrown Kamala under the bus. So maybe just...
I have to admit, I forget she exists sometimes.
On purpose.
And how is that even possible?
Because they're like, liability, she's a black woman, we don't want to terrify people. I'm like, learn from Republicans. What I said, and people laughed at me, I said Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to be the base of the party. Look what they've done. They've rallied around an anti-Semitic, violent conspiracy theorist nut. Can you, at the very least, unleash the 2 people that 81 million people came out to vote for during a pandemic? Unleash them, build a multicultural narrative, you still have a shot, and flux your muscle. That's what I want to see in the next 9 months. Or else it's a wrap.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm absolutely with you. Okay, final question. You sort of anticipated it, but because we're almost always talking about pretty heavy stuff on the show, because there's a lot going on that's challenging, to say the least. I'd like to ask you, what gives you hope, and how do you hang on to it despite all of the horrors?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm glad you asked it. The last chapter in the book actually is called Invest in Hope, but Tie Your Camel First, which is based off a saying, a Muslim saying, which is lovely, that says, yeah, have faith in God, but tie your camel first, which means have faith, but that's not enough. You have to exhaust all of your efforts, whatever you are capable of doing by your own two hands to fix your situation. And then after you've done that, leave faith in God, a loving God, and have hope that inshallah, once the page turns, it brings with it a better story. And the way I personalize it in the book, and even in my life, and in answering your question, is the only alternative to hope. If you're saying don't have hope, you're telling me to invest in apathy. You're telling me to invest in cynicism, which is cheap and lazy. And right next to me right now, as you can see, Mary, maybe a little bit, is my daughter doing virtual school, wearing a bow tie in her hair, wearing a dress, one of her 3 costume changes. She's 5 years old. And she's virtual schooled because she's immunosuppressed. Because at the start of the pandemic, about 8 months before the pandemic, she was diagnosed with stage 4 liver cancer and needed a full liver transplant. Lo and behold, yesterday was National Donors Day. And after doing a story and a call out, over 500 people stepped up to be an anonymous donor. Many people who didn't even know me. Some of those people were conservatives who emailed me and said, we hate your politics, but we want to save this daughter. And it reminded me that sometimes people can do good. Some people can change. Some people want to do good sometimes, right? And this girl who was not supposed to live is alive now because of a full liver transplant given by an anonymous donor who's now, he named himself Sean Zahir, who just happened to live close by. He was anonymous when he gave the liver. And it was after the transplant where I got to meet him. And he's doing better, and she's alive. And so the narratives that I had in my head during this bleak moment, this crisis of 8 months, was the data, the numbers, the facts. They pointed to this girl not surviving. And I imagine these narratives in my head, Mary, every day as the father after my family went to sleep, because I had to prepare myself emotionally. I'm like, I imagine myself burying my daughter. I imagine myself living a life without my daughter. I imagine myself making the phone calls to her grandparents. And I had to just steel myself for that tragedy. But then I also imagined this story where maybe, just maybe, miraculously, we'll get a liver donor and she'll live and I'll be at her wedding. And that's the narrative I chose to invest in and to work in. And so lo and behold, there's this little girl chirping and prancing around next door who's alive and well. And so that's why I cannot give up on hope. How can I? When people say you can't have hope, I'm like, I got hope right next to me. Yeah. And so I know I personalized it, but that's what gives me hope in America, because there's so many of us who have yet to achieve the American dream, but we're still striving for it. And we have the numbers, and we've come so far. And I refuse to let this American dream, this myth, if you will, be hijacked by a radicalized extremist minority that denies my children that right. So I will fight for my kids. I will fight for your kids. And at the end of the day, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen. If I got to go down, I'm going to go down fighting. But I don't think we'll go down. I think we have the numbers. And I still think there's a happy ending here, eventually, inshallah.
Yeah, that's amazing. It gives me hope to hear you talk about that. Wajahat Ali, thank you. It's been such a pleasure, such an honor to get to speak to you at length. I love your fight and your realistic take on what we're facing right now. Everybody go out, buy his book, go back to where you came from. It's phenomenal. And it will also make you laugh, which we really need right now. So, Waj, thank you again so much. This has been fantastic.
No, honored
really
to share the space with you. Honored to finally talk to you at length. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I appreciate the fact that you're willing to punch the bully in the mouth.
Anytime. Thanks. Now I get to answer your questions, which is one of my favorite things because I love hearing from you guys. If you have anything you'd like to ask me for next week's show, you can email me at mary@politicon.com. First question is from Mark in the Commonwealth of Dominica. Would you agree that racism is at the root of everything that is driving the Republican cult? I think that racism is at the root of all of America's problems, quite honestly. I wrote a book about it that was published in August called The Reckoning, and we have a long way to go before we solve those problems to the extent that they can be solved. The problem is that the longer racism and white supremacy have been allowed to go on as sort of the default in this country, the more the right has been able to legitimize it. And one thing Donald did was he gave them permission to make their racism overt. They're not dog whistling anymore. They're just being blatantly racist. And we see this with, a lot of people on the right are complaining that Joe Rogan apologized for using the N-word. So that having been said, though, I think there is one other thing that is propelling the right in the dangerous direction it's going in, and that's raw power. Their agenda right now is to regain power, no matter how illegitimately, and to stay in power even though they're the minority. So I think both of those things are going on. From Ryan in the UK, even if Joe Biden were reelected, it's going to take more than 8 years to solve the USA's many festering issues and more than one president to get America out of its current situation. I wanted to ask for your thoughts on this. Would you agree with my above observation? Yeah, I would. I think we need at least 16 years of Democrats in power, and not just in power the way they are now. We need much larger margins in the House of Representatives and in the Senate so that the next 2, 3, 4 Democratic presidents are supported and are going to be able to get the kinds of judges they want and the kinds of legislation they want. So that would also give us almost 2 decades for the Republican Party to get its act together. Because if there are any decent Republicans left, what they need to do is dismantle this party, burn it to the ground, and start from scratch. And that's going to take some time. I've had 2 similar questions from both Micheline and Heidi in Singapore. It's reported that the Canadian truck convoys are funded and coordinated by the global far right to disrupt consumer and military supply lines to hinder a NATO response to both Putin's aggression in Ukraine and a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. Thoughts? I have no doubt in my mind that these are astroturfs. This is not a grassroots movement. It's something that started on Facebook and was manipulated by the right in America, particularly on Fox News. It's possible that it was specifically to interfere. I don't know about NATO necessarily, but the Biden administration's ability to respond effectively. But I think it was a more general attempt to disrupt America's economy and use that as just another thing against Biden, to make people. It's the same thing they've done with COVID, right? The COVID numbers in terms of deaths were worse in 2021 than they were in 2020. And that's being used to blame Biden. But of course, it's absurd. The reason the numbers are worse in 2021 is because of what happened in 2020. Vaccine hesitance, vaccine refusal, refusal to take any measures to protect people from COVID. So I think it was more that, things like that have been used effectively to take governments down. And I'm a little curious why it took Canada so long to respond, but hopefully that situation is being diffused. But it could have been quite bad, especially if it had spread here, which was clearly the intention of the right. From Angela in Chicago, which is in Illinois. How worried should we be about a Donald version 2.0? Someone with Donald's charisma, for lack of a better word, with his qualities that made him successful in the Republican Party, and with brains. I think we should continue to be worried about Donald. Probably the only good news right now is that there is nobody in the Republican Party who can replicate what Donald's done. Charisma is exactly the right word. He is charismatic. It's hard for me to say that because I don't like to give him credit for anything. But if you met him, you would understand that there is that thing there that appeals to clearly tens of millions of people in this country. Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz, Tom Cotton, Jim Jordan, Kevin McCarthy, they don't have that. They don't have any of that. Donald's children don't have that. They don't have 4 decades of myth-making by American media. They don't have NBC elevating this failed businessman. So people outside of New York came to believe this total falsehood that he was a great success. They don't have that. So I'm sure that's what they're gunning for. Probably the person who comes closest is DeSantis, but he doesn't have any charisma either. They are all smarter than Donald, but that's not going to be enough to make a difference. But I don't know if we're going to have to worry about that anytime soon. From Barbara in Jenkins Township, Pennsylvania. Do you think it's possible Garland is just giving Donald enough rope to hang himself? I don't think it's possible to know anything that Merrick Garland is thinking or doing because he's not telling us. And that, in my mind, is one of his biggest failures. We deserve to know. We deserve transparency from this department that was so broken during the Trump administration, first by Jeff Sessions, then the middle guy who sold toilets, seems to be a theme, and then, of course, the worst of them, Bill Barr. So in order to get people to trust the Justice Department again, we should know at least something. What is he thinking about certain things? I know there's a lot that can't be said, and that's fine. But to be told nothing day after day, week after week, is pretty demoralizing. So I have no idea. I don't know if Merrick Garland is going to prosecute anybody for what happened on January 6th. I don't know. Any elected officials. I don't know. So hopefully we will get more information because the silence is kind of maddening. So that's it for this show. I'm so grateful that you were here today. And again, if you have any questions for me, you can send them to mary@politicon.com. And please follow us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts, except Spotify, and give us a 5-star review because we still took a hit from all of Rogan's Dude Bros. And more than that, it really does help people find the show. And you can now watch us on YouTube. So subscribe there. And don't forget to click on the bell because that way you will be notified every time a new show gets released. So thank you again for being here. I really look forward to seeing you again next week. Stay safe.